Hi there friends, welcome to episode 7 of Learn to Design, Then Knit. This is our final episode in the Forever Free series that allows you to learn how to knit and size a raglan garment for yourself. I hope you've learned a lot over the last 6 episodes and are excited to finish your garment with me this week. Today we're going to be talking about finishing. When we're working with a seamed garment, especially this raglan one, that means we've got to do a lot of seaming, not only at each side seam and the underarms, but we also have to piece all of the pieces of the yoke together. That'll be the front and the back halves of the yoke, as well as the sleeves. So I feel like I have to confess, I did finish the front of my garment. But I think the reality is it was a bit of a lofty goal for me to try and do all of this and create a new video for you in 2 weeks rather than 3. But here we are. I finished binding this off at 11 o'clock on Tuesday evening, and so this is Wednesday morning, and I am recording a video of how to put this all together with it unblocked. You'll see how it's curling in the top-down demonstrations. But let's just talk a little bit about blocking before you seam. So there are a couple of different ideas that I have about this. So there is nothing wrong with blocking your pieces before you seam your garment. The advantage to doing that is it will generally remove or alleviate quite a bit of the rolling that you will get at your edges. If we take a look at the front of this garment, for example, you can see my top edges are all curled down. The sides of my armholes really wants to curl inwards. So blocking would help that. And you can steam block or you can wet block. The reason, if I had had more time, I would have blocked this before today's episode because it will make seaming easier. However, this garment with this particular fabric is going to rely a great deal on structure. So I am less likely, actually, let's be real, I am not going to wet block it before I seam it. I will steam block it. Steam blocking is a way to allow the fabric to relax without having to submerge it in water. When you've got a garment that has this much flexibility in the fabric and you know that the seams are going to be what allows it to wear properly, fully submerging and getting it wet and allowing it to stretch out before you put those seams in is probably not a great idea. So if you've got a fabric that you decided to knit that has a lot more structure to it, you can absolutely wet block your pieces, allow them to dry fully, and then seam your garment. But if you've got a very drapey or holey fabric or one that has a lot of give, like this one that is based in fisherman's rib, you may want to consider steam blocking. Now, I'm looking at my notes here because I do have a video on steam blocking. In the description below, it's episode 41. There we go, episode 41 of my Knit Talk podcast. I walk through steam blocking using a household iron and steam block using a household handheld steamer. If you have a steamer, you may find it an easier way to go, but since most of us have an iron with a steam sitting at home, it's the method that I would say gives you the most flexibility in terms of manipulating the fabric as you steam it to allow it to lay flat. So all that to say, I did not block my fabric. It's not necessarily relevant to this video, but I promise you that once I have finished this video and I have some time later this week, I will be blocking my garment before I steam it, and I will be steam blocking it. I won't be wet blocking it. So with that out of the way, let's go down to our top-down view and take a look at the order of seaming, some tips that I have for seaming, and talk about the final bit of math that we need to do for our collar. So here we are with 2 very curly pieces of my garment. This definitely probably would have benefited from using some steam blocking to avoid things from rolling the way they are. But since I had less than 24 hours between the time that I finished this garment and before I needed to get this video done for you, we're just going to work with it because sometimes you just don't want to even take the time to block it before you seam it. So I'm going to start with the front of the garment. You can start with the back. It doesn't really matter. This one is just simply shorter, so it fits on my space a little bit better because it doesn't have the short rows on it. So before we do any side seaming or underarm seaming, we want to sew our sleeves to the front and back halves of our yoke. Because we used short rows on the back of our garment, remember that our sleeves are not going to be the same length down each edge. One edge is going to be shorter than the other from the cast on to the hem. So I can tell from this from this sleeve that this is my long edge. So my short edge is going to be the edge that I seam to the armhole edge or the front edge of my yoke. Numerically, the number of rows I have from my cast on point up at the top down to this marker that I placed is going to be the same number of rows on the short side of my sleeve. So all things being uncurly, these two edges would fit together very nicely. We're going to find the cast on point of the sleeve and just align it by hand with the cast on point of the front. We'll do the same down at the bottom of the armhole edge. We'll join our sleeve edge, and this is going to be the edge before you worked any ribbing. So this is going to be right here where I had my last increases in pattern. We're not going to use any of our ribbing to seam to the body. It will be the pattern, because this ribbing is what makes the sleeve. So this edge should line up here above the ribbing, and this edge should line up here. And thankfully they fit pretty well. I'm not seeing too many anomalies. So you can simply join your yarn and use mattress stitch to do this right now without anything helping you, but I really like to use locking markers to their best advantage, especially when I'm working with a smaller yarn like the fingering weight yarn I've used in this garment. So I've got a lovely collection of little locking markers here, and all I'm going to do is, starting at this locking marker, because I know that's the bottom of my yoke, I'm going to count up 5 rows. You can do 10 rows or 20 rows, whatever feels comfortable for you and your vision. And I count up from that point. I count up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You can see that this is really small. I don't know, I wonder if I can zoom in a little bit so you can see better what I'm doing. Let me see if I can zoom in on this just a little bit. Okay, there we go. So if we do that again, so I've placed a marker, I'll grab a second one and I'll count up again. So I've placed my marker here. I'll count up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And place another locking marker into that edge stitch. And I would do this all the way up the length of my yoke edge. I guess I can zoom back out now. So in essence, I'm going to end up with a line of markers all the way up this edge. Then I'm going to take my sleeve edge, and starting at that very bottom point before my ribbing, I'm going to clip it into that first locking marker. This is why locking markers are really useful, because you can lock in right from one edge to the other. Next, I would repeat the process. I would count up 5 rows and clip it into my marker. So essentially what you're doing is giving yourself markers or targets all the way up the edge of your 2 seams. That way you're guaranteed that as you're working your mattress stitch up the edge of your 2 seams, or I guess up the edge of your 1 seam between your 2 pieces, you're not going to end up miscounting and ending up with some rows at the top edge that you might need to fudge in. So again, this is just a tip from me to you on how to do this. There's nothing special about the mattress stitch. I've got a link in the description below to a wonderful tutorial from Barocco that shows you exactly how to work mattress stitch, and it's exactly the way I would do it. I simply don't have my own video to point you to for that. So we are going to repeat this process of seaming all 4 of our yoke edges so that by the time we're done, we have an entire square or neckline edge of our garment. So I'm going to go pin this all together because obviously I don't have time to seam it all together before we finish this video. So we can move on to talking about picking up stitches for our neckline and finishing the seaming on the body and the underarms. Okay, so now we're going to pretend that all of these locking markers and mini hair clips, which are a wonderful way to clip your work together if you're in a pinch, we're going to pretend that these are now fully seamed. Obviously we didn't have time. We can see that I've got markers up here holding them together, but I think this will give you an idea of what needs to happen next. So once the yoke is seamed, you have two options. You can go ahead and start your collar pickup, or you can seam the sides of the garment. I would probably seam the entire garment before I went to the collar. It really just depends where you're at, I suppose mentally, emotionally, if you just want to get that collar done. So let's just take a moment and talk about the seaming of the sides of the garment so we can look at what you want to consider when you're putting these edges together. Now again, bear with me. We've just got markers holding this all together at this point. But let's pretend that this sleeve seam and yoke seam is complete. We now have this little piece of underarm and we have the entire side of our garment to seam. So I had learned this from a friend of mine far too late in my knitting career to have thought about it much, but because so very often we knit garments in the round, the thought of seaming, or rather the order of seaming, is perhaps not as intuitive as it should be. So what I've learned is that when you are seaming the sides and sleeves of a body, you want to do two things. One, you want to seam them separately, not necessarily using the same piece of yarn, and you want to seam them in opposite directions. Meaning if you were going to seam this underside of your sleeve first, you would join a piece of yarn approximately 2 times the length of your seam. Obviously in that case it would be very little, but you still have to leave ends for weaving in. In any case, you will start your seaming at the underarm and seam outwards. When this seam is done, you'll break your yarn. Well, I guess your yarn is already broken, but rather you'll then cut a new length of yarn. Once again, that's about 2 times the length of the seam that you're seaming. And starting at that same point at the underarm, you seam down. The reason we do this is if you have any differences in rows, say you miss a row while you're going, or if you have used a measured length as opposed to a counted number of rows and you have a small variation in the total number of rows available, seaming down allows you to ease your rows together, meaning perhaps skipping a row here and there to ease the 2 lengths together, but you're doing it towards the bottom of the garment. If you do it as you get closer to the top, when you perhaps realize that you have too many rows, you can end up with bunching or puckering. So that's my big tip with seaming your side seam. You're still going to use mattress stitch just like you did for seaming the pieces of your yoke together, but you'll work outwards and downwards, not upwards and inwards. Because we've got seaming happening all over the place, we're going to have a little ridge on the inside of our garment where those seams occur, and that gives us lots of places to weave in our tails. So if you're worried about having to weave in all those tails, don't. It's definitely worth it to do these 2 pieces separately, and then you've got that ridge on the inside that you can weave those tails into really quickly without worrying about it showing through on the outside of your work. So here's an advantage of me not seaming the body before we talk about our neckline. Taking a look at this from a top-down perspective, we can clearly see each of the edges of our neckline edge that we created. These are all cast-on edges because we worked top-down on our garments. So if I had seamed the sides of the body before I showed you this, it would be much harder to get this perspective. However, don't let that sway how you approach seaming your garment. You won't necessarily need this visual because we're going to look back at all of the math from our previous weeks to see how we can approach this. So I'm just going to briefly show you this sketch which is an approximation of the top-down view that we're getting of this neckline edge. We've got the back of our garment, a sleeve, a very tiny piece of our front, then we've got our neck edge, we've got our center cast-on stitches, the next front edge, and again that teeny tiny top of our cast-on for the front, and our second sleeve. So keep this in mind as we work through the numbers for today's information on picking up stitches for your collar. Okay, I'm going to help you make sense of all of this, but essentially what we want to do, if you've been using the same method of tracking your numbers as I have, where we've got our garments separated into the back, the sleeves, and the front, it'll make today's exercise a little bit easier. But if you don't have all of these, that's okay. I am confident you have this information somewhere because you knit your garment. So what we need to do is two different things. I'm going to start with something that I call the golden ratio. The golden ratio is something that I have come up with over time that talks about, or that helps you work out the rate of picking up stitches for a collar. So I'm going to work through this relatively quickly, but I have a link to the video, a full video talking about this. It's episode 8 of the Knit Talk podcast. This is linked in the description below, and it walks through every single step of figuring out what your golden ratio is. This golden ratio is going to be personal to your gauge. So you're going to use your stitch and row gauge to determine what your golden ratio is, and use that to help you figure out the number of stitches you need to pick up down each vertical edge of your collar. So we're going to go and look first and foremost at our gauge. This is the same, it hasn't changed at all for the project. So I've got 20 stitches and 50 rows over 4 inches or 10 centimeters. So the math for the golden ratio is quite simple. You divide your number of stitches by your number of rows, and this gives you a decimal, or if you're like me and you think of it as a percentage, they're essentially the same, right? Any decimal that you multiply by 100 becomes a percentage. So to find the golden ratio for my gauge, I'm going to divide 20 stitches by 50 rows, and I get a decimal 0.4, or a 40% pickup ratio, meaning that when I come to these vertical edges, which are the curved edges from the front of my garment, I'm going to pick up 40% of the rows that I have available. The math gets quite simple. That 0.4, that decimal, is simply multiplied by our number of rows, and that tells us what our pickup ratio needs to be. So once I know that 0.4 or 40% is my pickup ratio, I have to find the closest rate of what that would be relative to the number of rows that I have. Now, conveniently, my numbers are both divisible by 10 evenly, so that means that a 0.4 pickup is the same as 2 stitches picked up for every 5 rows. If my gauge was 18 stitches over 24 rows, that gives me a percentage of 75%, or a decimal of 0.75. That means I would pick up 3 stitches for every 4 rows. Don't worry if you don't get this right away from what I'm giving you here. This is just a brief overview to help you get through this exercise. Go check out episode 8. Again, it's linked in the description below. That will walk you through all of the minute math that you need to do to figure out not only what your decimal is, but then what your rate of shaping is. It walks through multiple examples based on your results. But essentially, now that I know for my size that I need to pick up 2 stitches for every 5 rows, that means I will pick up 1 stitch and skip a row, pick up 1 stitch and skip 2 rows. Now, this is going to feel pretty strange. It's very rare that you would skip 2 rows in a row. However, because my row gauge is so short compared to my stitch gauge, this feels about right to me. So once we know that our pickup ratio is, well, what it is, 2 stitches for every 5 rows, or whatever that works out to be for you, we're going to go back to our front garment documentation where we created that chart for tracking our stitches. So we could find this in the week or the front of garment document that we created here, but this is just far more visual for what I want. So this document is telling me very clearly that I have 24 rows of my neckline over which I have to pick up stitches. Row 25 is where I cast on my stitches to cover that front span, so we don't count that. So go to row 24. So what I'm going to do is multiply my 24 rows by my decimal, which we learned above is 0.4, and I get 9.6. As we've discussed previously, we can't pick up decimal number of stitches, so I'm going to round that up to 10. So I now know that over or down that front curve of my neckline, this curve here and this matching curve here, I have to pick up 10 stitches over the available 24 rows. I'm simply going to break that down into the math that I know. So we've already established that the 2 stitches for every 5 rows is pick up 1, skip 1, pick up 1, skip 2. I can work that 4 times, which will give me 8 stitches picked up and 20 rows used. And because we can't pick up 9.6 and we round it up, we're going to have 2 little instances where we do pick up 1, skip 1, pick up 1, skip 1. This will give us those 2 additional stitches we need to make sure we get to 10. Plus it'll give us the 4 additional rows that we need to use up all 24 rows. So that's the most complicated math you're going to need to do for your front edge pickups. The rest of it is going to be using numbers from each of those 3-week documents to determine how many stitches we have available to pick up across our back, each sleeve, and the center front. So I won't bore you by going through all of these documents again, but we know we worked through all of these numbers to tell us how many stitches we had to cast on at each front edge, how many stitches we had to cast on at the top of each sleeve, and how many stitches we needed for the back of our garment. So hopefully you have these or a note somewhere that tells you all of these numbers, because all we now need to do is add up our stitches. We're going to make sure that for any of the cases where we cast on stitches, so the back, the top of each sleeve, and each tiny little front section, that we're subtracting 2 stitches. Now, those 2 stitches will not be there for you when you go to pick up these stitches. We have already seamed our yoke, so those 2 stitches are going to be gone anyway. So for example, when I cast on the back of my sweater, my target stitches, the total number of stitches I cast on was 39. Ideally, to get my target back width of 7.5 inches, I would have cast on 37. But remember, we added 2 stitches, 1 for each edge, that was going to disappear into each of those seams. So although I cast on 39, which I've noted here, we're going to subtract 2 because those 2 edge stitches, 1 from each edge, are gone. So from our original cast on, we subtract 2 and we end up with 37. So I know that across my back, I'm going to pick up 37. You're picking up at a rate of 1 stitch for every stitch that was cast on across the back. There's no fancy math that needs to happen there. We're now going to do the same for the sleeve, the front on each side, and the sleeve on each side and the front on each side. So our sleeve, I cast on 13. I lost 2 to the seam, so I'll have 11 stitches to pick up here. At the front, I cast on 7 and I lost 2 to the seam, so I've got 5. And then based on the math that we just did for our pickup rates down the front edge, I know that I'm going to pick up 10 stitches down this edge, and I will eventually pick more up here. However, when we cast on the stitches at the center front of our garment, we don't lose any stitches to any seaming there. So that's why I say all. So when I go back to this document one more time, I know that I cast on 11 stitches at the center front of my garment after all of that shaping was done. So once those curves were done, I cast on 11. So now I know that when I get to this center front section, I'm going to pick up all 11 stitches that I cast on. It's 1 stitch picked up for 1 stitch cast on. Now the next 2 pieces or 3 pieces are going to look very similar. We picked up 10 down this edge, and this is a mirror. So we're going to pick up 10 up this edge. We're going to pick up 5 for this tiny little front. Remember, that's our 7 stitches after losing 2 to the seam, so we're left with 5. And finally, we're going to pick up 11 across our sleeve. We cast on 13, we lost 2 to the seam, so we have 11 left. So in total, this actually works out very nicely. Adding all of these stitches picked up gives me 100 stitches. Now, because I was desiring a 1x1 rib, a knit 1, purl 1 pattern, that's perfect because this is divisible by 2. If I wanted let's say I wanted a knit 3, purl 3 rib, so a 6 stitch repeat, this number of stitches would not work because 100 is not divisible by 6. So if you run into a situation where the total number of stitches that you end up targeting is not divisible by the number of stitches that you want to have in your edge pattern, whether it's a 2x2, a 3x2, a 3x3 rib, the best place to fudge a stitch or 2 is going to be in these curved edges of your neckline. So where I decided to pick up 10 down each edge because I rounded my number up from 9.6 to 10, it might behoove me to actually round down and pick up only 9 down each edge, or perhaps round up 1 more and pick up 11 down each edge. While this edge is not infinitely flexible, because you're working at a ratio of pickup, you can adjust your stitches just a little bit to make sure that your total number of stitches is divisible by the stitch count that you need for your repeat. Okay. One last thing to consider before we complete this exercise is where we're going to start picking up our stitches for our collar. You'll notice that I discussed picking up the entire back 37 stitches first. Because this is a seamed garment, we want to start our pickup at a seamed joint. Many garments, especially if they're knit in the round, will have you start picking up in the center back. Part of that is simplicity. Part of that is you've got a yarn there, so it's easy to find, like your cast on tail will be there. And the other is simply a function of the fact that if there is any jogs in your work because there's a textural pattern or color work, it's very easy to expect there to be a starting point here for a collar. Because this garment is seamed and we don't have any kind of jog in the center back of our work, it makes sense to begin picking up for the collar at a seam. Aesthetically, it probably makes the most sense to start picking up at one or the other edge of the back, as opposed to, say, the seam at the front of your garment. While you may have perfect tension in your pickup and your ability to weave in your ends, and therefore aren't afraid of having to do that at a front edge, that's great. I prefer to do it at the back, just in case I don't do an excellent job of picking up, or just in case I don't do an excellent job of weaving in. We want these to be as least visible as possible. So it's really up to you whether you cast or you begin your pickup at the left edge or the right edge, but it would be my recommendation to pick it up at one or the other edge of the back. Okay, so that's gonna wrap up this free series on learning how to design a seamed raglan garment. I truly hope that you learned a lot of things in this series that you can then take and apply to other garments that you want to knit. A lot of the fundamentals that we covered today over this series, including how to figure out rates of shaping and how ease works on our body, will allow you to take this information forward and create garments in other silhouettes that you like or other styles, whether it's a drop shoulder, a raglan in the round, or a circular yoke garment. So much of what we covered in this course is going to be usable and applicable to any garment that you work in the future. Coming up this fall, I'm going to be restarting my Knit Talk with a Tech Editor podcast. That should be starting in late August or early September. If you've got ideas for future episodes of that podcast, things that you want to learn, I'm going to have a link in the description below to my submission form, and I will be pulling from those ideas for future videos to just help you on your knitting journey. So thank you so much for joining me on this podcast. I'm going to circle back actually and say, in the Ravelry forum, when you finish your garment, I would love to see photos of your finished garment. I will be taking some photos of myself wearing my new garment because although it's not super hot today, we got a bit of a reprieve, I know the heat is coming. So I will be looking forward to wearing my lightweight garment throughout the summer. So there we go. If you finish up and you feel like sharing, post it in the Ravelry group, which of course is also linked below. That's it. Thank you. It's been my pleasure to knit along with you and help you on your knitting journey and figuring out how all the math applies to garments. Have a wonderful rest of your week, and as always, happy knitting.